primary conditions that we represent veterans for is diabetes. Diabetes mellitus, or commonly referred to as type 2 diabetes. This is known as an Agent Orange presumption due to chemical exposure and defoliant exposure known as Agent Orange for veterans who served in areas that use such herbicide. But other veterans get it as well, and it's a systemic disease that can be quite debilitating. So the point of this discussion today is to really describe multiple things, how you should file a claim for diabetes. And this is one of the most important things that veterans get wrong. The types of diabetes, A1C levels, and how the VA defines diabetes, and then Agent Orange exposure versus direct exposure on active duty or a direct service connection. And then lastly, the relevance and importance of establishing logs to demonstrate your symptoms. So let's start with, how are you going to actually file for diabetes type 2? When a veteran files for diabetes, they tend to just put diabetes. This is a problem because diabetes in and of itself doesn't compensate too well under the VA's rating schedule. Quite the opposite. You might get 10 or 20% for diabetes. Where veterans get significantly higher evaluations is when they claim all the ancillary, or commonly referred to as secondary, conditions for diabetes. And this list gets quite long, but you have diabetic nephropathy, which is more of a renal impairment, where you get chronic kidney disease. Then you get diabetic retinopathy, or different ocular conditions affecting the eyes. The eyes can involve retinopathy, glaucoma. You even get some type of macular effects from diabetes. Then you get into the heart. A lot of veterans will get ischemic heart disease or different types of heart diseases because of diabetes. Then you get into the nerves, and a lot of veterans will get diabetic neuropathies. There's a host of different nerve impairments that are caused by diabetes. And the reason I'm listing all these, and we're going to keep going here, is you have to file these things additionally. You can't just file for diabetes. It goes on. Erectile dysfunction is a common one. Peripheral vascular disease, where you lose blood flow to your extremities throughout your whole body. You have an impaired blood flow and circulation, and that can cause pretty severe issues. Then with the blood flow and some of the circulations, you start getting into skin problems, and you also get into foot problems. You get these foot drops, and people lose their ability to really sense their feet. That can be a nerve impairment. That can be a vascular impairment, i.e. blood or nerve, neuropathy or blood issue. Then you get some people with all these other issues, they develop a little bit of depression. Depression secondary to their diabetes. You also get hypertension is a big one as well. So these things are conceded by the VA and known by all medical professionals to be secondary to diabetes. Again, diabetes is a debilitating systemic disease that has a lot of arms causing other issues. So when a veteran files for diabetes, they need to expressly list all of those conditions on the claim. If you don't do that, you're hosed. You're hoping the VA is going to pick up those contentions. You're hoping that the examiner is going to go looking for those contentions. Let me tell you something. When you get into a VA examination, the doctor's only going to do what's listed there. Because if they do more, they're not going to get compensated. They might not get compensated for the additional work. They're going to do precisely what's in front of them. So if diabetes is all you claim, all those secondary conditions are going to be missed a lot of the time. So most important thing when filing for diabetes is file it correctly. Look for every condition under the sun. When you have diabetes, there's two different types. You have type 1 diabetes and you have type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is usually the type where you're born with it, or maybe you develop it before the age of 30. They do have instances of late stage onset type 1 diabetes, but that's the exception. So we're trying to talk to the norms here. So in most instances, individuals who are type 1 diabetic aren't even eligible to go on to active duty. So you rarely see it in the veteran disability compensation realm for that reason. Type 2 diabetes is the primary one that you'll be filing for, and that's diabetes mellitus, not to be confused with diabetes insipidus. One of the criteria the VA uses to determine whether you have a diagnosis of diabetes mellitus is the A1C levels. So, and this is an accepted principle in the medical community. Where a veteran's A1C level is 0.49 or lower, that's known as prediabetes. And again, we're referencing the A1C laboratory findings. Where a veteran has 6.5 or higher, that's when they will establish a diagnosis of diabetes. So if a veteran has a diagnosis of diabetes but does not have an A1C laboratory finding of 6.5 or higher, the VA won't accept that if they do the job properly based on their policy interpretation. They will not accept that as a affirmative diagnosis for VA disability compensation purposes. So again, that A1C level of 6.5 or higher is going to be important. Now, thankfully, that 6.5 mirrors the standard interpretation of the generally accepted medical principles that most doctors follow. So they tend to go hand in hand, where you have a diagnosis of diabetes mellitus type 2. And the VA also agrees. Both doctors tend to say that, yeah, you'd have 6.5 A1C level or higher. So to bring it full circle here, to establish a diagnosis for VA disability compensation purposes, for VA purposes of diabetes mellitus type 2, you need an A1C level of 6.5 or higher. So how do you get service connection for diabetes? Well, there's really two primary ways that you see it. You see it with an Agent Orange presumption, which is a real common one that most law firms are dealing with. And then you have another one which is known as a direct theory of service connection. There's this last one known as secondary, and we'll just touch on that at the end because you don't see that much of diabetes. But the Agent Orange presumption is getting into the Vietnam era. If a veteran served in an area where tactical defoliants, Agent Orange specifically, and other defoliants were used, we have a different YouTube video on this exact topic that you can reference for more information. But where a veteran served during the respective period, the prescribed period that the VA has set forth, and develops diabetes mellitus at any point in their lives, then they're eligible for a presumption that the exposure while on active duty in fact caused their diabetes mellitus. So that's the most common one. That's the easiest one. That's a slam dunk for most attorneys. When a veteran's denied service connection for diabetes, and an attorney gets a case and they say, oh, well, you served during the right time, the VA's conceded Agent Orange exposure, and you have diabetes, everything lines up. And so those are good cases for attorneys because they're fairly straightforward and easy for us to point to the laws and win. Where things can get a little trickier is when you go for a theory of service connection known as direct service connection. Now that's to suggest that this condition began on active duty, not a presumption that started 30 years after you separate from active duty, but while on active duty, within the confines of your DD-214, whatever that time period is, that direct service connection means that your condition began, or the incident or the condition began while on active duty. So you don't see this a lot, because most people develop diabetes in their mid-40s, diabetes type 2, and most veterans, most active duty service members are getting ready to retire right about the time you'd start getting that diagnosis. So you don't get a lot of direct service connection. However, it does happen. So where you'd want to look is at your laboratory findings. If you're treated with metformin and you're treated with different medications for diabetes or insulin, then it's really going to be conceded, or it should be conceded by the VA. But if you're not treated with some of these conditions, but maybe you develop some of those other secondary conditions like a neuropathy and like a renal nephropathy and like a peripheral vascular disease and all these other conditions that are attributable to diabetes, but they never do the proper workup to determine whether you have diabetes. And let's say you develop diabetes 3 years after active duty, you had the onset of those conditions, which would likely be attributable to diabetes, on active duty. So you should be able to make an argument for direct service connection under that. So even if you didn't serve in Vietnam and weren't exposed to Agent Orange or one of the other areas that had Agent Orange used, it doesn't mean you've lost your argument if you had some of these other conditions that started on active duty. And so those can be a little trickier, but the arguments can be pretty strong if you get a judge or an adjudicator that knows what they're doing. One of the things that you're going to want to focus on when you know that you're going to get awarded service connection for diabetes is you also want to establish the degree of your symptoms and impairment. So there's multiple ways to do that. Probably the most important way is to be treated for all these secondary conditions that we talked about at the outset of this video. But another way is through symptom logs. Symptom logs are quite powerful, actually. Judges and adjudicators tend to give them more credence than you would ever imagine. And it's nothing more than a diary. It's you documenting in real time and contemporaneous evidence showing judges and adjudicators a diary of your symptoms over the course of X amount of months, however many months you keep those logs. And that really can be probative to a fact finder to show the severity of your symptoms. We have these on our website. We offer them as for free out to society because we think they're quite beneficial. So we direct our own clients all the time to those and to that website, to our website. And I would encourage you to do the same. It's www.vadisabilitygroup.com. But those symptom logs, which are under the resource tab, you're going to want to fill the general one out. And you're going to want to list every symptom that you have because there again, once you have service connection established, the next step's going to be demonstrating the severity of your impairment, the degree of your symptoms, getting to what's called the rating schedule criteria of all those ancillary conditions. We have in the video description, we provided a few links. The VA's provided a training letter, which is training letter 00-06. And this one provides a real nice overview of things you should consider applying for of diabetes as the VA sees it. So again, that's training letter 00-06. And there's a few other links that we provided in the description as well. I recommend you check those out, and that includes our symptom logs on our website. So diabetes is actually found in the VA rating schedule. When you're trying to determine the severity of impairment, you're going to go to 38 CFR 4.119, and that's going to be the endocrine section. So diabetes is found as a residual of the endocrine. And diagnostic code 7913 or 7913 specifically gets into the diabetes mellitus criteria. So there's really several things you really need to be aware of for diabetes itself. We're not talking about all those ancillary conditions. We're talking about the diabetes itself and how that's evaluated. They're looking at, are you taking metformin or some type of pill, or are you taking insulin, regulation of activities, regulation of diet. Those are the four primary things that you need to really focus on. Now, if you have ketoacidosis or if things get more severe, that's going to be in the record. So it's not really something you communicate. They're going to have to find some of these more severe types of implications caused by diabetes in the record. But make sure you tell them if you've been hospitalized with diabetes residuals, because usually you'll see some of those more severe things with the hospitalization. But primarily, where you see veterans struggling with their diabetes evaluations is they fail to tell them about a restriction of diet, restriction of activities, the medicine that you're taking, whether it be insulin or metformin. So those are going to be the primary things you're looking at for diabetes itself. And again, all those secondary things are equally, if not more important, to establishing a good evaluation for your diabetes claim.